Morning to you, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Okay, you're thrust into the limelight as a 17-year-old on Britain's Got Talent. How old do you think you were when you realised you had that voice?
What's the act called?
Charlotte and Jonathan.
You thought the combination would work?
It was our singing teachers, actually.
Okay, you're not saying much, Jonathan. Are you shy?
Sometimes.
He was just a teenager when he stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage. Shy, trembling, barely able to look up. But then he opened his mouth, and what came out stopped the entire country in its tracks. Jonathan Antoine's voice wasn't just good. It was otherworldly, operatic, soul-piercing, powerful. Overnight, he became a household name. But behind that unforgettable moment was a life few could have imagined. Crippling anxiety, years of bullying, silent breakdowns, and a secret diagnosis he wouldn't even discover until nearly a decade later. The world fell in love with the voice, but they never saw the pain it was hiding. And what Jonathan finally reveals now, at 29 years old, changes everything. Jonathan Antoine was born on January 13, 1995, in Essex, England, a quiet town with postcard-perfect charm. But inside the walls of his childhood home, and especially within the halls of his school, his world was far from peaceful. From the age of 4, Jonathan knew he was different. Other kids ran confidently into playgrounds. He hesitated, unsure of how to belong. His weight made him a target. So did his sensitivity. By 6, children were throwing food at him in the lunchroom and mocking the way he walked. But the real pain wasn't just the bullying. It was how invisible he felt to the adults who were supposed to help. Teachers looked the other way. Parents of other students avoided eye contact. He became the child that everyone pitied from a distance, but nobody defended up close. At home, his only refuge was music. His parents noticed early that he could hum entire movie soundtracks after hearing them once. By age 7, he could sing with perfect pitch. By 8, he was composing songs in his head to calm his panic. His mother, Julie, remembers walking past his room and hearing complex arias coming from her son's voice. Untrained, but already deep with emotion. But that gift didn't protect him from the trauma piling up inside. His weight climbed, his confidence vanished, and by 10, he was already showing signs of emotional collapse. Then came the diagnosis that changed how everything was viewed in hindsight. Years later, doctors would identify what he had always felt, but never been able to explain. Jonathan was living with a form of autism spectrum disorder, one that had been missed for over 2 decades. He wasn't just quiet. He wasn't just different. He had been struggling to make sense of a world that overwhelmed his senses, misread his intentions, and punished his uniqueness. And all the while, buried beneath the fear and confusion, a miracle of a voice was waiting for someone, anyone, to truly listen. The first person to truly hear Jonathan's voice was a substitute music teacher named Mrs. Everett. It was a cold Wednesday morning, and the class was supposed to be preparing for a holiday assembly. Jonathan was trying to blend into the back row, hoping the day would pass quietly. But when Mrs. Everett asked each student to sing a single line from a carol, Jonathan had no choice but to comply. What came out of his mouth didn't just stop the class, it stunned the teacher. His voice was rich, resonant, and untrained, yet somehow refined. She described it later as hearing the echo of something ancient trapped in the voice of a child. That day, she pulled him aside and called his mother. That single moment would trigger a quiet but radical shift. With encouragement from Mrs. Everett, Jonathan joined a local choir. It wasn't glamorous. It met in a cold community center twice a week. But for Jonathan, it became a sanctuary. There, he could sing without judgment. For the first time, he wasn't the overweight boy at the back of the class. He was the soloist. he learned to project without a microphone, to read sheet music by ear, and to control his breathing when anxiety tried to shut his body down. His voice was growing faster than anyone expected, so much so that he was invited to compete at a regional music festival by the time he turned 12. At that competition, he faced students who had been privately trained for years. Jonathan had none of that. No vocal coach, no stage presence training, no polished wardrobe. He stepped onto the stage in a sweater that was a size too big and sang O Sole Mio. And he won. Not just his category, but the entire youth division. The judges gave him a perfect score for tone and interpretation. One even whispered to a colleague, "That boy is going to sing in halls none of us will ever be invited into." Still, while his musical journey was starting to blossom, Jonathan's emotional state was still fragile. The praise didn't erase the years of teasing or the daily fear of rejection. After each performance, he would retreat to silence. He didn't celebrate victories, he endured them. The applause was loud, but his inner world remained quiet, confused, and aching for something more than just success. He wanted understanding. He wanted peace. And most of all, he wanted to know who he really was beneath the voice everyone kept applauding. By the time Jonathan entered secondary school, his talent had become undeniable. But talent didn't shield him from the cruelty of adolescence. If anything, it made him stand out more. While others played football or chatted about pop stars, Jonathan spent his lunch breaks humming Puccini or scribbling lyrics into his notebooks. The bullying got worse. He was called names not just for his size, but for being different, for being sensitive, for daring to be something they didn't understand. And through it all, Jonathan remained quiet. He absorbed the pain, let it sink into his skin like ink into paper. But at home, in his small bedroom filled with books and CDs, he would sing until the sadness trembled out of him. That pain had an outlet: performance. When he stood on stage, something shifted. The stage became a battlefield, and his voice was the weapon. It wasn't about showing off, it was about survival. Every note he sang was a way to reclaim dignity in a world that often denied him any. At age 15, he entered the Essex Regional Music Challenge, a prestigious event with over 50 competitors. Most had been groomed for this kind of stage, with polished performances and expensive lessons behind them. Jonathan showed up in a borrowed suit and shook as he waited for his name to be called. He sang "Bring Him Home" from Les Miserables. When the last note hung in the air, the audience was still. Then a wave of applause crashed over him. Judges scored him 97 out of 100, nearly a perfect score, and he walked away with the first-place prize. More than that, he was offered a scholarship to a summer training program at the Royal Academy of Music. It was a lifeline, a chance to be around others who lived and breathed music the way he did. But Jonathan was still battling demons no one could see. Even as the world began noticing his talent, Jonathan couldn't silence the voice in his head that said he wasn't enough. Not talented enough, not thin enough, not normal enough. And yet, his voice kept carrying him forward, pulling him into brighter rooms, grander halls, and eventually, toward the moment that would change everything. A duet that would rewrite his destiny on national television. It all started with a whisper in the music room, just a quiet suggestion from his teacher. Pair up, try a duet. Jonathan, now 16, had grown more confident in his abilities, but still recoiled at attention. Enter Charlotte, a year younger but already seasoned in performance, with a sharp wit and the kind of charisma Jonathan lacked. She was bold, expressive, and unafraid. Their teacher saw it instantly. Their voices might be magic together. Jonathan wasn't so sure. He didn't think he deserved the spotlight, let alone to share it with someone who seemed born for the stage. Their first rehearsal was awkward. Jonathan barely looked up from the sheet music, but when their voices met in harmony, even Charlotte fell silent. Something clicked. The warmth of her soprano filled the spaces between Jonathan's powerful tenor. It was like they had been singing together for years. They began performing around school, first in classrooms, then in small assemblies. Jonathan still battled anxiety. More than once, Charlotte had to coax him out of hiding before a show. But each time he stepped forward and sang, the crowd forgot what he looked like. They just heard the voice. Word spread fast. Local venues started calling. Retirement homes, churches, community centers. They played anywhere people would listen. Their set list was small but powerful. The prayer became their signature. A music teacher's wedding gig turned into a standing ovation that left elderly guests in tears. They made only a little money, but for Jonathan, each show was healing. The applause drowned out the echoes of childhood taunts. For Charlotte, it was fun. For Jonathan, it was therapy. Then Charlotte heard about Britain's Got Talent auditions. Jonathan resisted. The idea of standing on national TV, his face, his body, his nerves, all exposed for millions? Terrifying. But Charlotte didn't give up. For weeks, she nudged him, reminded him what his voice could do. On the last day to submit, with barely 15 minutes left, she uploaded their video. Jonathan didn't know it yet, but the countdown had already begun. Not to failure, but to everything changing forever. The backstage hallway at the London Palladium was buzzing with nerves. Jonathan sat hunched over, his hands shaking, trying to steady his breath. It was April 2012, and Britain's Got Talent was moments away from introducing him to the world. Charlotte sat beside him, confident, brushing her hair and practicing lines. Jonathan, however, was trapped in his own storm. Cameras, crowds, judges, especially Simon Cowell, represented every fear he'd spent years avoiding. His clothes were simple. No flashy jacket, no styled hair. He looked more like a boy walking into math class than a star in the making. And that's exactly what he feared. Being laughed off stage before even singing a note. When they stepped out under the hot lights, the crowd went quiet. Simon's glance, followed by a smirk, felt like a knife. "Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse," he whispered to fellow judge Carmen Electra, thinking the mics weren't catching him. But they were. Millions would hear that line on TV. It would later become infamous. Jonathan stood silent, trying to disappear. But then, the music started. The prayer. Soft piano. Then Charlotte's voice, warm and clear. When Jonathan finally opened his mouth, everything changed. His voice poured out like a wave, controlled, powerful, and heartbreakingly beautiful. The judges froze. Simon's face shifted from smug to stunned. By the time they hit their final harmony, the entire audience was standing. A 4-minute performance had turned 2 kids into overnight legends. All 4 judges said yes, but more than that, the world did too. The clip went viral instantly. 3 million views in days. People compared him to Pavarotti, to Susan Boyle, even calling him the future of classical music. But behind the applause was a truth few understood. Jonathan had almost walked away. Just days earlier, he had nearly backed out, afraid of being mocked, of being judged for how he looked. But now, that same boy had stunned a nation. And this was only the beginning. The days after Jonathan and Charlotte's viral audition were a blur of press, rehearsals, and overwhelming praise. But for Jonathan, each moment in the spotlight was a battle. While fans saw a rising star, he still saw the bullied boy who used to eat lunch alone, dodging food being thrown at him. Fame didn't erase trauma. It magnified it. And as they moved into the semifinals of Britain's Got Talent, the pressure was crushing. During rehearsals, Jonathan often struggled with anxiety so severe that he couldn't speak. Before one performance, he locked himself in a bathroom stall for over 30 minutes. Charlotte coaxed him out, again and again, sometimes wiping away his tears before leading him back to the piano. Their bond, though built on music, had become something more: survival. He leaned on her, calm. She drew strength from his voice. But the stakes were rising. In the semifinals, they performed Caruso, a dramatic, emotional piece that demanded perfection. Jonathan was shaking so badly before going on stage, he had to sit and practice breathing techniques just to stand upright. Yet once he sang, his voice didn't betray a single crack. The audience erupted. Judges were speechless. And Simon Cowell, who once mocked Jonathan's appearance, now called him one of the most gifted singers to ever grace the BGT stage. But then came a moment that threatened to break everything. After the semifinals, Cowell publicly suggested Jonathan should ditch Charlotte and go solo. The suggestion, meant to propel Jonathan's career, stunned fans and Charlotte. Everyone held their breath. Would Jonathan chase the spotlight alone? His answer was immediate and firm. "We've come this far as a duo. We'll stay a duo," he said. The audience cheered. In that moment, Jonathan proved he wasn't just talented, he was loyal. He chose friendship and integrity over instant fame. It was a decision that won hearts, but also complicated the road ahead. As the finals approached, tension grew. Jonathan's voice had become a national treasure. But so had the story of the duo, who wouldn't let each other fall. Still, not even their incredible performance in the finale could guarantee victory. When the results came in, they had placed second, losing to a dancing dog act named Pudsey. The shock was real. The disappointment, crushing. But what happened next changed their lives more than any trophy ever could. In the days following their second-place finish, Jonathan Antoine faced a whirlwind unlike anything he had known before. The tabloids wanted stories. Agents lined up with promises. Record labels threw around numbers Jonathan had never imagined possible. And though the public outcry over their loss was loud, many believed Jonathan and Charlotte had been robbed. It didn't take long for both of them to land a major record deal with Simon Cowell's label, Psycho. Their debut album, Together, dropped later that year and soared to #1, 5 on the UK Albums Chart. It was a classical crossover masterpiece, soaring ballads, sweeping duets, and their now iconic renditions of The Prayer and Caruso. Jonathan's voice matured, becoming even richer, more powerful, more precise. Critics praised his potential. Some even whispered he could become the next Andrea Bocelli. Tours followed, TV appearances, interviews, glamorous gowns for Charlotte, tailored suits for Jonathan. But under the surface, things were shifting. Jonathan was still battling demons. The anxiety that had followed him like a shadow didn't disappear just because he was on a magazine cover. In fact, it got worse. The constant travel, the interviews, the pressure to smile, it all wore him down. He was still a teenager after all. And with his name on billboards and photos plastered in shop windows, he had nowhere to hide. There were nights he couldn't sleep, days he couldn't eat. At times, he considered walking away from it all. Meanwhile, he and Charlotte began to drift, not in anger or rivalry, but naturally. They were growing up, growing apart, and developing different artistic visions. In 2014, they announced they would no longer perform as a duo. It was bittersweet. Fans mourned, headlines speculated, but Jonathan spoke softly, firmly. "We'll always be friends, but it's time I figure out who I am on my own." That same year, he released his first solo album, Tenore. It was raw, dramatic, personal, and it debuted at #1 on the UK classical chart. Suddenly, the world saw Jonathan Antoine not just as half of a viral duo, but as a true solo force in classical music. But while his voice soared higher than ever, his internal battles were far from over. He still had a secret, one he hadn't shared with anyone, one that would explain everything, but would take years to finally understand. By the time Jonathan Antoine turned 25, his voice had graced the world's greatest stages. Royal Albert Hall, Carnegie Hall, even a few performances abroad that left foreign audiences weeping in awe. He had racked up awards, critical acclaim, and the kind of global fan base most young singers only dream of. But behind the baritone brilliance and rising stardom, Jonathan was still on a journey far more difficult than hitting the high notes. In private, he was still battling the weight he had carried since childhood, both physical and emotional. His body, though stronger now than it had been in his teenage years, had been a constant battlefield. Years of bullying had hardwired shame into his system. Even as stylists dressed him for press tours and magazines praised his talent, Jonathan couldn't always look in the mirror without flinching. For him, losing weight wasn't just about appearance. It was about healing from years of feeling invisible, or worse, ridiculed. But the bigger battle was inside his mind. He had never publicly spoken about it, not in detail, but quietly, through whispered mentions in interviews and moments on social media, Jonathan began to reveal the truth. He had struggled with depression. Deep, consuming depression. The kind that left him unable to get out of bed for days. The kind that made him question why he had survived his own success. There were moments, he admitted, where the applause felt more like pressure than praise. Moments where he felt like an imposter, just a scared kid in a suit, pretending to be someone strong. But something shifted in his mid-20s. He began therapy. He started opening up, not just about music, but about mental health, about vulnerability, about survival. And when he did, something remarkable happened. The same fans who had cheered for his voice started cheering for his courage. Jonathan began using his platform to advocate for mental health awareness. He spoke to young people about self-worth, about not letting your weight define your worth, about the importance of asking for help. And through this advocacy, something unexpected happened. His own healing accelerated. The more he spoke, the more he felt seen. Not just as a tenor, but as a human being. In 2020, amidst the chaos of a global pandemic, Jonathan released Going the Distance, an album that marked a new chapter. It wasn't just about showcasing his vocal range, it was about resilience, about growth. Songs like How Great Thou Art and These Are the Special Times took on deeper meaning. Fans said they could feel the shift in him, more open, more grounded, more powerful. And in the years that followed, Jonathan's evolution only continued. He began exploring original music, dabbled in songwriting, even hinted at a possible memoir. He slimmed down considerably, not for fame, not for critics, but for health, for freedom, for peace. In interviews, he now spoke with clarity, often smiling when discussing his past, no longer hiding from it. One of the most powerful moments came during a live show in 2023. Jonathan paused before singing Nessun Dorma, one of the most demanding arias in the operatic canon. He looked out into the crowd and said, "This song used to terrify me. I didn't think I was worthy of it. But tonight, I sing it for the boy who was too afraid to leave his room. This is for him." The applause that followed wasn't just for his voice, it was for his journey. Jonathan Antoine is no longer just the shy kid who shocked Simon Cowell. He's no longer just the next Pavarotti or that opera kid from YouTube. He's something rarer, a survivor, a soul who turned pain into power. And while his story is still unfolding, one thing is clear. His greatest note isn't one he's sung, it's the one he's lived. A note of hope, a note of truth, a note that says, no matter how dark it gets, your voice, your true voice, is worth hearing.